Welcome to Reducing Gun Violence, a Duke panel. My name is Carlee Goldberg, and I will be serving as the moderator. I am a Duke freshman from Parkland, Florida. For very obvious reasons, the issue of gun violence is something that is very important to me. I started off learning about it in an academic setting, in the classroom, in debates, in the news, and through a horrible tragedy this past year, it went on to impact every aspect of the place I call home. But before Parkland became this site of a mass shooting, and before it launched an era of student activism, it was a place full of people who believed this conversation had to happen. So I thank you all for joining me. The panel was initiated by a student by the name of David Frisch. He is a current Duke junior. David is studying abroad, so I will happily read a statement he has prepared for this panel. David started putting this panel together shortly after the Tree of Life shooting in his home neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, at the synagogue where his parents were married and his closest friends regularly attended. As we will discuss, gun violence is never just about guns. It also always intertwined other issues, whether it be anti-Semitism, racism, mental illness, or child neglect. Yet it was guns themselves that took the lives of his family, friends, and community members. Even when we cannot eliminate the source of hatred and violence, we can do more to curtail their power to destroy. The goals of this panel are to better understand the nature of gun violence in America and to discuss concrete actions in which we ourselves and our government can take to reduce gun violence. We hope you enjoy this panel. Following, we will have a 15-minute Q&A followed by a reception. So thank you all for coming, and let's begin with an introduction of our panelists. Starting from my right, we have Professor Philip Cook, who joined the Duke faculty in 1973 and is now the Terry Sanford Professor Emeritus of Public Policy, Economics, and Sociology at Duke University. His research focuses on data behind gun violence, specifically understanding how and why to separate guns from violence through effective regulation and law enforcement. He's the author and co-author of books on alcohol, the economic cost of gun violence, and, with Kristen Goss, The Gun Debate, What Everyone Needs to Know. He has served as a consultant with the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division and the U.S. Department of Treasury Enforcement Division. Professor Darrell Miller serves as the Melvin G. Swin Professor of Law, teaching in the areas of civil rights, constitutional law, and legal history. His scholarship on the Second and 13th Amendment has been published in leading law reviews such as Yale Law Journal and has been cited by the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as in congressional testimony and legal briefs. Along with fellow panelist Joseph Blocher, he's the author of The Positive Second Amendment, Rights, Regulation, and the Future of Heller. Professor Joseph Blocher serves as the Leighton L. Smith Professor of Law, teaching federal and state constitutional law, the First and Second Amendments, and legal history. His current scholarship addresses issues of gun rights and regulations, free speech, and refugee law. He has published dozens of articles on those topics and others in the Yale Law Journal, Sanford Law Review, and other leading journals. He has also written for the New York Times, Vox, and Courts. Before coming to Duke, he has clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals, as well as practiced law, where he assisted for the merits briefing in the District of Columbia v. Heller. Finally, Professor Jeffrey Swanson serves as the professor in psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University School of Medicine. He is a sociologist who studies the effectiveness of laws and public policies designed to prevent firearm-related violence and suicide and to improve outcomes for adults with serious mental illnesses in the community. In 2017, Dr. Swanson's research group published the first study showing the risk-based, time-limited firearm removal laws can prevent suicide. He is currently the principal investigator of a multi-state research study to evaluate the effects of states' different minimum age standards for firearm purchase by adults with juvenile criminal records. He frequently also serves as a consultant to public policymakers at the state and national levels. We have brought together 4 immensely qualified professors from distinct fields because we know this issue requires more than one outlook. And we hope in this panel we can provide those perspectives. All right, so starting from Professor Swanson, can you tell us about your background investigating and trying to reduce gun violence?
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out on this dismal night to talk about this heartwarming subject. I got into studying the relationship between violence and mental illness as an assistant professor in Texas many years ago as part of a project to estimate the numbers of people in the entire state of Texas who would need mental health services. And if they, in addition to having a mental health diagnosis, were likely to be violent towards others or harmful towards themselves, then they were going to be at higher priority for the state. And in the course of doing that, I learned that a couple of things. One, violent behavior is a very complex human behavior with lots of different things that come together to cause it. Mental illness is actually kind of a minor factor there. But I also learned that we didn't really know at that time what the relationship between violence and mental illness was, because all the studies that have been done were done in the criminal justice system, people already selected to be violent, or in the mental health care system, people already selected into treatment, and we didn't really know. So the study that we did actually provided those estimates, and we learned that the overwhelming majority of people with serious mental illnesses are not violent. There is a higher relative risk, but all these other things come together to cause violence. The risk factors for it are kind of non-specific. It's very hard to predict. So flash forward, and now in recent years, when there's a horrifying mass casualty shooting, and that's when we focus in the media on mental illness, and that's when we focus on gun violence, and that's kind of unfortunate because the mass casualty shooter is really atypical of both of those problems. But I get these calls, and somebody from the New York Times will say, well, why do we let mentally ill people have guns? And so I got interested in studying the laws that are designed to actually disqualify or prohibit certain people, certain categories of people with mental illness, those who have been involuntarily committed and so on, from having guns, and do those laws work? And so we published some articles about that, learned that maybe it works a little bit, but the overwhelming majority of people at risk are not disqualified from guns, so we need a different approach. This is kind of a complex puzzle in our country where guns are very prevalent, private gun ownership is constitutionally protected, and so it really takes a lot of thinking, and it's not just one thing that's going to solve it. And that's what I'm working on, and I'm hoping that's what we can address tonight.
Professor Blocher?
Sure. And let me start also by thanking you, Carlee, and the sponsors, and all of you for being here. It's great to see you. As Carlee mentioned in the introduction, I'm a lawyer, and I come at this mostly from the constitutional angle. My work focuses on the Second Amendment. And in fact, almost to the day 11 years ago, I was writing a brief in a case called District of Columbia v. Heller, in which the Supreme Court ultimately held in the summer of 2008 that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms for certain private purposes, including self-defense in the home. Prior to that, the Second Amendment had been interpreted by courts to apply just to the organized militia, the well-regulated militia in the first clause of the amendment there. And that intersects, my work and Darrell's work, intersects with work that people like Jeff and Phil and others do, I think in interesting ways that it may just sort of be helpful to sort of lay out the battlefield as we see it. There's sort of, as I see it, three characteristics that any gun proposal has to have in order to be successful. It has to be, as a matter of policy, it has to achieve some important end to reduce the harms of gun use and misuse. It's a policy question, the kind of question that Jeff and Phil and others evaluate. It has to be politically feasible, that is, it has to be able to get through the sort of gamut of obstacles that the American political system presents for any kind of gun proposal. And then third, and this is the part that Professor Miller and I focus on, it has to be constitutional. And all of us, I think, should be focusing our energy to the degree we can on the laws that overlap. The ones that satisfy the policy condition and the political condition and the constitutional condition, right? The ones that are right there in the middle. And there are laws that get two of those, but not the third. So to pick just one, assault weapons bans in some parts of the country are politically popular. They have been almost universally upheld by courts, so they satisfy the political and the constitutional. But as Professor Cook can tell you much better than I can, the empirical evidence on how many lives they save is mixed. So the policy thing is a little murkier for those. Maybe better written laws or better enforced laws can make a difference, but so far we don't have a lot of good evidence there. There are other kinds of laws which are politically popular in some places, and as a matter of policy have been shown probably to be effective. Local handgun bans, for example, but they fail on the third prong because they're not constitutional, at least after District of Columbia v. Heller. So the work that Professor Miller and I do is really about the boundaries of this box, the constitutional one, because as we see it, and as we may see from the Supreme Court by the end of this term or next term, when this Second Amendment is invoked successfully, then a gun law, no matter how successful or popular, is going to be struck down. So if there's a theme of my work, it's that gun rights and regulation really can coexist in ways that sometimes people underappreciate.
Professor Miller, can you give us your perspective from another law point of view?
Great. So again, I extend my thanks to you and to everybody else, and I apologize in advance. I have got a cold I picked up from my daughter, so I might sniffle here in the midst of it with my eyes. Much like Joseph, I approach this particular issue like he does as a lawyer. I'm a trained lawyer and practiced before I joined the academy over a decade ago. And Ryan Kim, I'm interested from a legal perspective. Everything that he said about the sort of different circles that need to overlap with policy, politics, and the Constitution is absolutely right. What I think I add to this particular discussion is I've always been also interested in the intersection of this particular area and history, especially Reconstruction history. I'm also a scholar of Reconstruction of the 13th Amendment, as Carlee had mentioned. And so the intersection of gun violence and race is of particular importance to me as a scholar and as a sort of societal problem. I'm also interested in it as a state and local government scholar as well, which is one of the things that Joseph had mentioned is that there's a lot of gun regulation or gun protection that's happening not at the federal level with the Second Amendment or with federal law, but happens at a local level, whether we're talking about preemption statutes that states might pass to prevent localities like Parkland from enacting their own kind of gun control measures, or whether we're talking about certain types of tweaks to whatever the state constitutional law is that might be more gun rights protective, requiring more evidence, for example, that the regulation is going to be effectual and not interfere with gun rights. This is the kind of new dynamic of the new era after District of Columbia versus Keller with respect to guns, and it's an important one. And the third aspect of my research and interest that sort of overlays with what Joseph has talked about is the interaction between gun rights and other types of rights or values that we have. For example, I think it's very important that in the future we sort of sort out in things like bringing guns to public protests. What is the interaction between things like gun rights and the right to peaceably assemble? What is the interaction between guns and other kinds of values like education that we might think of as being important and even constitutionally specified at the state level? And that's how I approach these issues in line of interest.
And Professor Cook, if you can give us the public policy point of view.
Yes, good evening, everybody, and let me add my thanks to David and Carlee for bringing us together this evening. Let me just point out that Duke, largely by happenstance, has gathered a number of the nation's leading experts on different aspects of gun violence prevention. There's a fifth person, at least, and probably others as well, Kristen Goss, who can't be with us tonight because she's heading up the Duke in DC program. But she handles the politics. You see we have the law covered and the mental health issues that Jeff is interested in. And I've been working on various aspects pretty much forever, but since 1974 particularly, when it was a pretty lonely business. Now there's a lot more of us you two are doing this. Let me talk a little bit about my interest. My PhD is in economics. And so you might ask, well, what does economics have to do with this? The answer is quite a bit. So let me talk briefly about three of the topics that I've been concerned about. Two of them are the intersection of economics and bumper strips. So the first one is the old bumper strip that says guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that means, I think if it means anything, is that it's the assailant's intent that matters, not the type of weapon that they use in terms of what actually comes of the attack. And that's an issue of technology, right? So economists study technology, and so one of the early papers I worked on was the technology of personal violence. And one of the things that economics teaches is that technology almost always matters. And I certainly believe that it matters in the case of violence, that the tool actually has a big influence on the outcome. If it's a gun, then it's more likely the victim will die than if it's a knife, for example, or some other weapon. And that it's not just intent. So that's been a hot area of research, and it also continues to be something that divides people that are involved in this as scholars or as advocates. A foundational issue, one that can be researched and where I think economics has something to say. The second bumper strip is that when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, one that you might have heard. That's a statement about how markets work. And it's particularly a claim that there's a particular group, outlaws, dangerous people, who have highly inelastic demand. And so if we outlaw guns, prices go up, the transactions costs are higher, and so on. And who will be left with guns? Well, the answer is just these dangerous people. That's an assertion along the way. Both of these bumper strips are, by the way, if it isn't obvious, trying to make the case against gun control. Both of them play against basic economics along the way. And so I've spent much of my career studying those issues and found contradictory evidence. The third thing is maybe the most foundational, and that is that gun violence imposes a very heavy tax, if you will, on our standard of living, and that's true everywhere. That is, it's an important issue, it's an issue worth studying, because in the current circumstance, it degrades the quality of life for everybody, not just, although certainly including those who live in communities that are heavily impacted by gun violence. And I've found in city after city that the mayor or the police chief will say reducing gun violence is the highest priority that we have in this area. I think that that's very reasonable, and that it extends also to the rest of us who don't, fortunately, live in such communities because of the threat that gun violence poses through Parkland and mass shootings that now make no one feel, everyone feel vulnerable along the way. There are 4 million kids, according to the Washington Post recently, that went through lockdown drills last year. It's everywhere.
So Professor Cook, if you could sum up all of your research, and especially your book in the gun debate and what everyone needs to know, what would you think everyone really needs to know?
Yeah. I'd say that they should buy the book and find out. Although these guys also have a pretty good book that you might want to check out. So, but Let me say that one thing that I think is very helpful is to keep the perspective of history on this. And the history has changed dramatically during my lifetime in my career. I moved to Durham in 1973. North Carolina was a rural state, and it still is to a large extent. And there was widespread ownership of rifles and shotguns in North Carolina, used primarily for sporting purposes and to control varmints. Not so much about handguns, not so much about revolvers and pistols. Farmers don't have much use for them, and in fact the state regulation was quite tough on handguns. So pistol permit requirement was in place, which said that if you were going to acquire a handgun legally, then you had to have two character witnesses testify to your good moral character, and furthermore had to demonstrate a reason why you had to have a gun, a handgun. The other thing that is remarkable looking back is that there was a flat-out ban on concealed carry in North Carolina. You just couldn't do it. So what happened since then, of course, is the ban has been repealed and replaced by a fairly weak licensing requirement, and the pistol permit requirement, fortunately, is still in place, fortunately from my perspective, but it also has been weakened. It's been part of a remarkably successful effort by the National Rifle Association that was going on in the 1970s and 1980s especially, that had the effect of, first of all, getting the states and cities and localities out of this business by state preemption laws. And second, it had the effect of rolling back many state regulations in the area and blocking the Congress from effective action.
All right, so we know that the gun fund has obviously changed in terms of regulations. So let's understand the main point. How do we make gun violence safer and gun ownership safer in America? Professor Swanson, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
So let me give an example of how a policy or a regulation that's very well intended sort of comes up short given the unique circumstances we have in the United States, and then an example of another one that I think is actually very effective in how different policies work together. So one way of constructing this problem is to say that particularly after DC versus Heller, we can't do what some of our peer countries in Western Europe and Canada and the UK and Japan and Australia do, which is to broadly limit legal access to guns. We have to do something more difficult, which is to try to figure out who are the people who are so risky that it's justified to limit their Second Amendment right. That's hard to do. But I think as a consequence of that, bumper sticker way of saying that would be, that we don't have gun control, we have people control. But is to say, let's focus on that point of sale, that point of or purchase to permit, and say, how do we identify people who shouldn't have a gun? And we have some regulations dating back to the 1968 Gun Control Act. We have the Brady Law that instituted background checks. We have the National Instant Check System, and we put a lot of emphasis into trying to make that work. And there's actually some evidence now that it doesn't work very well in the way it's currently implemented. There are a lot of reasons for that. One is the criteria that we have don't correlate very well with actual risk. There are lots and lots of people who are disqualified from guns who actually don't pose much risk at all to anybody. They might have had one involuntary commitment 25 years ago. On the other hand, there are tons of people who actually do pose a risk. They're just impulsively angry, short-fused people. They own guns legally. They would pass a background check. Or people who plan to harm themselves. In our study, 72% of those people who ended their life with a gun actually could have passed the background check. So the criteria need to be better. The records that are in there, the background check database is only as good as the records that are there. And those records are quite spotty. Some states report a lot of records, some states don't. Maybe in one state it's the mental health authority that's reporting the involuntary commitment records, and they don't even know about all the other commitments in the private mental health system and so on. And then you have the problem that there are so many guns and that a lot of gun transfers, and Professor Cook has studied this, take place outside the background check system. Those are private transactions. There are people that buy guns at gun shows. There's that kind of loophole. And then you don't have a comprehensive and consistent law that covers all the states. So you have the state-by-state statute. The same person could be disqualified in one state and not another state. So that's a policy where, you know, it sounds good and everybody's for it. Let's just pass universal background checks. That's going to solve the problem. It's not going to solve the problem, at least not the way it's currently implemented. So that's one example. Another policy that's emerging that actually I think is getting some traction and is quite promising is called extreme risk protection order laws. And that is a civil court ordered, time-limited, preemptive gun removal law that puts a tool in the hand of law enforcement that says police can have the clear legal authority to search for, remove firearms from people where there's clear evidence that they pose a risk to harming someone else or themselves, even if they don't have any gun disqualifying record. And it also allows family members, depending on the state statute, to go to a judge, get this risk warrant, and take the guns away temporarily. There's due process protections on the front end of it. It's time limited, and we did a study in Connecticut that showed, looking at 765 cases, the average number of guns removed in each case was 7 guns per person. The suicide rate when we matched the death records was 40 times higher than the general population. But for every 10 to 20 of those gun removal actions, one life was saved through an averted suicide. And people don't know this, but about 2/3 of the gun fatalities in this country are suicides. And you know, the big difference, Professor Cook talks about technology, 90% of the people who try suicide survive, with one exception. People who use a firearm, they almost never survive. That's because they use such an efficient killing technology. It takes such little effort, pointed at the brain. It's a catastrophic injury, people die. If we did nothing to change suicidal behavior, the motivation, the intent, all we did was change the methods to something more survivable, we would save lots and lots of lives. That is, 13 states have now passed this. We need more evaluation to see whether it works. We have a paper coming out looking at Indiana. And last about this, it is a policy that actually has support from people who disagree with each other on the politics of gun control. Gun people support this as well, and it's partly because this, you take the bumper sticker, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, here's a law designed to help us figure out who those people are. And so it's a place where you have kind of a common swath of real estate. It's not the only thing. This is not a one-thing problem. It's not a one-thing solution. But that's one that I think is well worthy of expanding and studying.
Professor Miller, Professor Blocher, what's the legality surrounding trying to pass Second Amendment laws and controls, such as the extreme risk laws that Professor Swanson?
It's a great question and a hard one. We spend a lot of time obviously wrestling with this question, but I'd say generally, if there's a misunderstanding about it, it's worth correcting. It's that people too often think that you have to make some kind of choice between gun rights and gun regulation, like that those two things can't coexist. And I mean, if there's one overarching simple theme of our scholarship for the last 10 years, it's been that's not true as a matter of history. It's not true as a matter of doctrine at any point in American history, including the one we're in. It's not good policy either. Constitutional law doesn't work that way. People often talk as if, I oppose gun control because I support the Second Amendment, or vice versa, right? I can't have, and that's just a false choice. That's not what law requires. The harder questions, and the ones that we try to wrestle with, are what kinds of regulations are constitutional. And there, just as a matter of description, since the Supreme Court's big decision in Heller, which is the one in 2008 that said there's a private right to arms, courts have basically been circling around what we call a two-part test, what lawyers call a two-part test, that Professor Miller could probably describe.
Right, so the two-part test, which is a little bit inside baseball for lawyers, is the test of the lower court. So the District of Columbia versus how it had to do with a special officer with the Federal Judicial Center who wanted to have a pistol in his home. His name was Dick Heller, and he was not permitted to have it because the city of Washington, D.C. had passed a gun regulation in response to fairly rampant crime in the 70s that made it almost impossible for a person to have a handgun in the House. There were there were some exceptions. There's some grandfather provisions in, but he wanted to have one. And his lawsuit was sort of the culmination of a long history of the National Rifle Association making their vision about an individual right to keep and bear arms aside from the militia, the law of the land. And he was successful in the District of Columbia versus Heller case, but that only had to do with his case. He wanted to have a pistol in the home, and the court ruled what some people have said, I think rightly, is a kind of a quote-unquote Delphic opinion, where there's things you kind of know, but other things you're not sure about. For example, regulation is permitted, but the scope of that regulation is not quite fleshed out. The case was about a person having a gun in the home, but there's lots of unanswered questions about carrying guns outside and all these other kinds of issues. There was an important part of the opinion where Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion, said nothing about this opinion should impact or cast doubt on longstanding prohibitions on guns for felons or the mentally ill or guns in sensitive places like schools and government buildings. But that's just, that's just a statement. It's not a way of analyzing a new case. So the two-part test essentially says, how are we going to find out what kinds of things fall within the Second Amendment? What kind of things actually present a Second Amendment question? So some things just don't present Second Amendment questions. If you are a felon in possession, you're categorically excluded from the ability to possess a gun. Minors are the same thing. Certain dangerous and unusual weapons. Concealed carry, according to the Heller opinion, is sort of categorically excluded. Then the question comes to, if something is covered, what is the level of protection for that thing? So not everything is protected 100%. There might be justifications that the government can offer as to why, even though you might have the Second Amendment right, that is, you've raised the Second Amendment question, it doesn't protect you in that specific circumstance. You want to carry the gun, in a place where harm is likely to occur. The government has shown sufficient information to show that, in fact, it's risky to have guns for these people or these types of guns or in these places. And even though it's a Second Amendment question, it's not protected. And that's the way that the lower courts are resolving these issues.
Thank you. So, Professor Cook, taking that type of analysis that Heller has established, do we see any trends that has led to in terms of gun violence or in gun regulation?
Well, I think that the interesting trend is not exactly a trend, but it is what has been described as the tectonic shift in gun politics that happened in February 2018 with the Parkland mass shooting. To a large extent, because of the leadership of the students coming out of that school, and then leading immediately to a raft of rather surprising states getting on to toughen their gun regulations in a variety of ways, starting with Florida. And in the 2018 election, we saw a number, especially in the congressional races, that were outspoken supporters for stronger gun measures, including universal background checks and the red flag laws and a variety of other measures that I think have real prospects. Whether those are going to be challenged in court, I think absolutely that everything has been challenged in court. It's a free-for-all out there. And that's one of the reasons why research is important in this area. Even if the legislators don't pay much attention to it, the courts often do.
Can I just want to inject one important thing about the Parkland phenomenon was a recognition that, as everybody on this panel understands, again, mass shootings are very salient. They're very scary. know they feel safe. I certainly don't. The idea that my kids have to go through some kind of lockdown procedure. When I was growing up, we had tornado drills and we had fire drills. The whole concept that we would have a drill because somebody was going to come into the school to kill everybody was just inconceivable. Very, very salient, but also still pretty rare. I mean, now not as rare as other countries, which have like 0. But it's still rare compared to the other types of violence that occurs, whether it's suicide or the sort of constant drip of gun violence that occurs, not in suburban communities, but in the inner city. So one of the phenomena I think that was important about the Parkland sort of mobilization was a recognition that the kids in Parkland and the kids that live on the west side or the south side of Chicago have something in common with respect to a salient, very deadly important issue for them.
So it seems we're addressing 2 major issues. We have the rare issue of mass shootings, and then we also have the more individual cases of suicides or of murders. Can you, Professor Swanson, as someone who's seen these types of research that Professor Cook and Professor Miller and Blocher do and seen it in action, give us your thoughts on that?
Right, so just to put that in perspective, yeah, mass shootings are very disturbing. They're very frightening. It's kind of an existential threat, an existential crisis, because the idea that we have to be afraid in public places, it's just it's so irrational, and it's everything we don't want ordinary life to be. So we demand some kind of easy solution to it. But if you step back for a minute and you look at it from a public health point of view of firearm-related injury and mortality, those mass shootings and people who die in those incidents represent less than 1/10 of 1% of the gun deaths. If we could have stopped all of the mass shootings since the beginning of this century, we would have saved about 500 people. I'm talking about public mass shootings. If we could have stopped gun suicides, and I have 3 gun suicides in my extended family at different points in the age range, we could have saved more than 300,000 people. So. And the solutions to one are not necessarily the same as the solutions to the other. To give you an example, with red flag laws, kind of ironically, almost all of those laws have been enacted as a legislative response to a public outcry about a mass shooting. That's the case with the first law in Connecticut that was passed in 1999 after the terrible mass shooting in the Connecticut State Lottery headquarters in 1998. That's the case in Indiana. The second law was passed in about 2005 or 6, I think, after a shooting involving several law enforcement officers, a man with schizophrenia. But as the laws are actually used, if you look at how they're used, 60% of those cases are cases where there's a suicide concern. We're worried about granddad. He's bereaved. He's all by himself. He's depressed. He's drinking heavily. He has 15 guns. He doesn't want to give them up. What do? Well, in many states, there's nothing you can do. In Connecticut, and Indiana, and California, and Washington, and Oregon, and Maryland, and Florida, and Vermont, and Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and I'm probably forgetting 1 or 2, you now can do something. You can reach out, and a lot of times there's this information. So, I think the other thing I would just say is one of the important functions of public health laws is to change norms over time, public norms and attitudes. We had a big controversy about seatbelt laws. The gun manufacturer, the car manufacturers were very against this. We had all these anecdotes about somebody who died because they got hung up with their seatbelt, notwithstanding overwhelming evidence that seatbelts save lives. But those laws were passed. Now, how many people get in their car and you put on your seatbelt because you're worried it's a law and I have to put this on, I might get a ticket. No, you just put it on because it's natural. You'd feel kind of naked without it. You don't even think about it. And I think that's what we kind of need in terms of a change in our culture about thinking about gun safety. And that's a big challenge right now, because if you look at public opinion, more and more, lots of people have guns. More people now have guns for personal protection. They believe that more guns make people safe. You have candidates for office on one side of the political spectrum who stand up at the NRA convention and say we need more guns in the hands of more people in more places, that's going to make us safer. And people believe that. In opposition to lots of research that says just the opposite, that household gun ownership increases the risk. So we need not only research on what works, but we need to think about our culture and the fact that gun ownership is embedded in our culture. It's wound up in the iconography of our social history, and we love guns in this country. They're not going away, and we have a heck of a lot of them. And so, you know, the solutions need to take that into account as we think about guns, gun violence, and how we separate risky people from this really efficient killing technology at the right time. It's a hard thing to do.
Absolutely, and in addition, I think a very big issue when you get into gun control is the tendency to take one side or the other. So Professor Blocher, as a lawyer, I imagine you like to argue and debate. So why don't you give the best argument you've heard completely in the opposite of what you believe, or in terms of the opposite of the gun violence control, in terms of people who would argue for less gun control, and why you think, or where you think you can go in terms of those arguments when you get into them.
So I'll take the best argument on the constitutional side, because those are the kinds I tend to field. Whenever I get hard policy questions, I just send them to Jeff or Phil. So I would say the strongest argument against the argument that I articulated earlier, which again is that gun rights and regulation can relatively well coexist, is that we don't want rights and regulation to coexist, that the Constitution exists to put some starch in the rules to keep the government from infringing on, and that's the word in the amendment, infringing on one's rights. Like what I say about rights and regulation living together, would I say that about other constitutional amendments? I say that about free speech, equal protection? And if not, doesn't that mean that you're disfavoring the Second Amendment as compared to other amendments in the Constitution? And there's doctrinal arguments there, but are, as Darrell sort of suggested earlier, are a little bit of sort of inside baseball for lawyers. And there's something to that. I mean, I believe that the Constitution means something, and although I was on the losing side in District of Columbia v. Heller, I think that Heller means something, and that since 2008, there are laws that are unconstitutional today that were not in 2007. In fact, for 200 years, there were no federal cases anywhere in the United States that struck down a law on Second Amendment grounds, more than 2 centuries. Since 2008, we've had more than 1,000 post-Heller Second Amendment challenges, and depending on how you count, at least roughly 100 of those have been successful. That's a big change, and I don't think that's all wrong. I think people are right to say there has to be something to a constitutional right. What gives me hope, and where that conversation usually goes, is that I think it's often driven by fear and mistrust. I think when people make the argument, and certainly in policy and political realms, it's driven, there's a lot of fear. As Professor Swanson mentioned, it's worth emphasizing, the predominant reason now that people give for owning guns is fear of others. And that has not been true historically. Until just a few years ago, the most common reasons for gun ownership were hunting and recreation. But this is a phenomenon now which is so deeply intertwined with that fear and mistrust that so thoroughly just seems to suffuse our politics that it leads into constitutional law as well. And so when people articulate the absolutist vision of the Second Amendment, it's often because they're quite afraid that somebody is going to come and take all their guns, that there's a confiscatory movement afoot, and that without the Second Amendment, there would be government agents kicking in their doors and taking away their 7 or their 15 guns. Now, I can look at any study, any poll, and point to evidence that that's never going to happen. It didn't happen before Heller. It never would happen after. But what seems to resonate the most with people is just actually having the conversation with someone, me, who they expect would articulate that vision. And there's something about the sort of face-to-faceness of it, and I'd say validation, but the kind of conversation that seems to move the ball at least a little bit.
Patience in talking.
It takes a lot. I mean, as you said in your opening remarks, Carlee, and I guess David did as well in the comments he sent us, like it's a conversation. It just has to happen, and too often just gets drowned out by shouting from either side.
All right, well, to end this, before we open it up to Q&A, I'd like to pose a question to the entire panel. Besides buying Professor Cook and Professor Blocher's book, what do you think we as students or as the general population can do to address the issue of gun violence?
I have a one-word answer. Vote. I think that's actually one of the really positive messages and outcomes that come out of the Parkland movement, which is, and you hear this, and I have had the privilege of meeting with some of the survivors from that shooting in the school is to reach out to people in the younger generation to try to motivate them to get involved in civic participation and to see that this matters to them. And I really think that if that worked, many of these problems would probably improve, just because many of I think the more problematic attitudes are kind of stuck and ossified in an older generation. I mean, that's kind of my view, and I think that you're on the right side of history and should take advantage of that opportunity.
Jeff said and what Phil said earlier, combined, we've been working on these issues for a very long time. Darrell and I have been on it since Heller, so about 11 years. There's been I have not seen a moment like this one since in the years I've been working on this. Well, the Parkland movement has had a sustained push thus far, which is unlike even the push that we saw after Sandy Hook, which was a big one. And that I think is really hopeful for those of us who think that we could do better on reasonable gun regulation. What Jeff said in his last comments is right too, that this is operating against a backdrop of sort of cultural difference and deeply embedded archetypes and views about what guns mean and kind of how they fit. And for us as constitutional lawyers, that kind of stuff is really hardwired. I mean, politics moves much faster than constitutional law. But 11 years ago, when I was working on that brief in Heller, there was no constitutional law to speak of on the Second Amendment. Right? We were learning it as we went. It wasn't that when I picked up to write that brief, I had failed to learn something in law school. There were literally no cases that anybody was teaching. And what changed and what culminated in this big Supreme Court decision was a multi-pronged, dedicated, as Phil mentioned earlier, campaign largely spearheaded, but not exclusively, by the NRA over a period of decades to change people's understanding of what the Second Amendment meant. It is a remarkable thing to go from 0 cases striking down any law on Second Amendment grounds to now an active field of litigation about which a person could write a book. I mean, that's a big, 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 big change. And that's not a partisan thing. I mean, in the lead up to Heller, this was a left, right, and center, all judges were interpreting the Second Amendment, almost all judges, in the same way. I mean, people like Robert Bork and Warren Burger, who are justices whose names you might know. Warren Burger, Republican, rock-ribbed, right-wing Republican justice, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, "The view that the Second Amendment protects an individual right is the greatest fraud, I repeat the word fraud, ever perpetuated on the American people by an interest group in my lifetime." And 20 years later, it was the law of the land, right, by the court in which he once sat. And so, in a way, I guess I mean this as a hopeful message for you all, that the message could change this quickly in one direction. And make no mistake, Heller is a popular decision. The American people, 3/4 of them, agree with the decision in Heller. But if you made that poll 30 years ago, I don't think they would have, right? Those cultural and even constitutional things can change. They changed one way, they can change the other way, but that'll be up to people like you.
It's also spawned a lot of research.
It has spawned a lot of research. We're here because of it.
Professor Miller?
I'll yield my time.
Professor Cook?
Yeah, let me just add to this discussion that Jeff initiated, and that is to say that if you do want to get involved politically, the opportunities to do that have greatly increased in recent years, thanks to Everytown Mom's Demand Action, Gabby Gifford's organization. That it's a much more robust situation that's organized in every state right now, that something we just did not see in the past, where there was no voice on the other side of the argument to the National Rifle Association. Now there is a voice. That voice is robust, and it certainly can use additional volunteer help. If you don't like politics, then there's also a lot of good that can be done just by volunteering with groups like the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham, or other groups that are trying to work directly with the victims.
But just one more point to add to that. Sometimes it's easy to get a very dismal view of the opportunities to change gun policy at the federal level, and it's probably true that at the federal level things are still pretty paralyzed. It's a pretty radioactive topic. If you look at what's happening in the state legislative context around the country, you know, the majority of Americans now live in a state with stronger gun laws than was the case at the time of the Newtown shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And you have actually, as a citizen, a much bigger opportunity to influence lawmakers at the state level than you do at the federal level, probably. And so, not to think it's all just, well, we have to do something and get, you know, Congress in Washington to do something. There's so much that happens at the state level that can have an impact, and we can see huge variability in the scope of the problem from state to state, and actually correlate ecologically with the strength of gun laws and other things.
Thank you all so much. At this time, I'd like to open it up to any questions from the audience. You could raise your hand and we happily ask the panel. You in the blue.
So, sort of the last question was talking about what we could do. This is sort of an extension of that. You talked about how, you know, people think that more guns will make them safer, but that's not really true. How can we like communicate with people when research shows that something is the case, but it's very unintuitive for them, and it goes against what they just naturally think? They want to believe their intuition over the research. Like, what are tips for communicating with people and sort of making them understand what the research shows? And there might be no answer, obviously.
For the researchers.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the question not about the research, but about the communication part of it, which is a somewhat different issue. And I think the suggestion here is that often a personal communication one-on-one is going to be ultimately the most influential way to go, where you can have a conversation with your uncle and, you know, point out risks that he is probably very familiar with, but somehow doesn't put together with his political stance on guns and on Second Amendment issues. And say, you know, remember so-and-so who was a drunk and he was always waving his gun around. And, you know, is that the guy that you want to have? When you think about more guns are better along the way. Or my daughter, who is a school teacher in Durham, and her response to the idea of arming teachers is, you know, us teachers, we can't even control our cell phones, let alone the gun. You know, we have no idea, you know, how to protect something as dangerous as a gun in a classroom situation. And it's that kind of grounded information in one-on-one conversations that somehow can chip away at the kind of massive ignorance.
Sure. We take another question. Sir, in the blue sweatshirt. Yeah. That's you. Yeah.
Professor Blocher.
Yes.
What do you think about the constitutionality of risk warrants?
Of risk warrants. Tell me more about what
Sure. What Professor Swanson described, that police could unilaterally decide that someone posed a threat to society and barge into their house, it seems, and take their private property.
So, based on how you asked the question, I have a sense of where you are on the issue. So there's sort of, I guess I'll answer it this way, to say that a law like that can raise lots of constitutional questions. As a Second Amendment matter, there might not be one, but that doesn't mean there's a due process issue, Fourth Amendment, and other kinds of issues, which are kind of beyond, you know, the scope of sort of firearms law. This same kind of question gets raised often when proposals come up which are quite popular or sound really popular. You all might remember the no-fly, no-buy proposal after San Bernardino, where it was said anybody who's on a government watch list for and not allowed to get on an airplane should be able to buy a gun. And everybody said, yeah, of course, definitely. Without paying a lot of attention to the fact that to get on that no-fly list actually doesn't require a whole lot of due process in the first place. And so, yeah, if there had been a civil adjudication, which in most of the situations Jeff has worked with and described, there's some robust front-end adjudication, then no constitutional problems. But there's no such, a general warrant is abhorrent to constitutional law.
Can I just add a piece of information about that? In Connecticut, I mean, the laws vary a little bit from state to state, but there was a lot of effort that went into crafting a statute that would have due process. So what you have at the beginning is there's an ex parte court order, so the parties aren't present, but it requires two police officers to fill out these forms that meet particular criteria. They both have to stand as what's called co-affiants. It has to be run through the state's attorney, and then a judge has to weigh in on that. And that can happen very quickly in real time. That's to remove the guns, secure the guns, and half the time there's a serious mental health crisis. That person's taken into the hospital. But then within 2 weeks, within 14 days, there's a requirement for a hearing in which the state has the burden to prove by clear and convincing evidence that that person meets the criteria for posing a risk of harm to self or others. A number of states vary on how they do that in terms of the length of time and what the standard of proof has to be on the front end. Sometimes it has to be clear and convincing evidence, and sometimes there is this balance of how do you make it really hard to do these, what kind of judicial oversight do you require? Like in Maryland right now, it's a commissioner who's not a judge, and they're on call 24/7, and Friday nights and a citizen can do it. Who should be able to petition it? Those are things where there's a lot of debate, I think, both on how effective those different features of the law might be, and also to what degree they provide adequate protection for this term pre-deprivation due process versus post-deprivation due process. So it's a good question, but I think in the end it's a balance of risk and rights, and people are going to disagree based on where you stand. If you care more about the Second Amendment right than anything else, you might think that's inappropriate. If you have lost a loved one to gun suicide, you might think about it differently.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. All right, the lady in the black shirt.
Hi, so I'm from Turkey, and when I came to America 2 years ago, I was just dumbfounded by gun violence and mass shootings. I had absolutely no idea what that was. We have nothing remotely similar to that back home, and I guess I'm just wondering why it's so prevalent here in America.
That's a very hard question
Yeah.
for all of us. We can say, maybe we'll start from the constitutional side and say that we are, I believe, unique, but certainly not, we're certainly an outlier, if nothing else, in having something like a constitutional guarantee to arms. So again, the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary for security of a free state, that is one of the provisions of our Constitution which has not been copied by many others. And basically maybe every other provision of the Bill of Rights you will find copied in other places. So we start with a sort of legal baseline which isn't necessarily present in other places. But the complicating explanatory factors there go to culture, history, politics in ways that I couldn't possibly begin to describe. Phil would know this 100 times better than I would, but I believe that where we are truly an outlier is, as you put it, in the gun violence realm. In violence, we are not as much an outlier. In the fatality rate associated with our violence, we are off the charts, and that can be, I think, pretty easily tied to the fact that when we fight, we are more often using guns than people in other places.
Yeah, our crime rate, our violent crime rate, if you can compare us to, pick 15 or 16 countries in Western Europe and the UK and Australia and Japan, we're right in the middle. We just have an average violent crime rate. But if you look at our homicide rate, we're several times higher. And that has to do with our unique relationship to firearms. Because when there is a violent assault, it's on average, according to these OEC data, about 3 times more likely that a gun would be involved. So if you think about it, 2 or 3 young, immature, impulsive, intoxicated young men who come out of a pub in the UK or somewhere in Europe, and they get into a fight over something, somebody's girlfriend or whatever, and somebody gets a black eye or a bloody nose. In one of our big cities, it's just statistically more likely that one of those young men will have a handgun and will use it and you'll get a dead body. That is embedded in our homicide rates. And a lot of homicides begin with arguments like this. And so it really has to do, it isn't that the behaviors are that different, although mass shootings is kind of a different phenomenon. There's this unique sort of cultural script that's out there that certain alienated, angry, isolated young men are following for reasons that are poorly understood. That's a different thing. But in general, it has a lot to do with what Professor Cook talked about at the beginning, the technology that's there. And that is a big part of understanding the problem and trying to think about the solution.
And our last question, gentleman in gray sweatshirt.
Yes, so this is probably a question more for the professors of law. What is like the consistent constitutional distinction that courts have made that uphold assault weapons bans as compared to like handgun bans, considering like the definition of an assault weapon kind of changes depending on like the legislation and like who passed?
Takes this first.
I mean, so one of the things is the Heller decision is kind of cryptic. So there's one place in the opinion where Justice Scalia makes a sort of offhand reference that about being able to ban M16s and the like as presumptively somehow outside constitutional protection. Another portion of the opinion talks about the weapons that are protected as opposed to being dangerous and unusual are those in common use. But that's a kind of circular argument because what's in common use is in some sense diametric of what is not regulated, right? And so there's a circularity problem with that. And so the lower courts in some senses are trying to deal with, for example, extended magazines or these questions about assault weapons and how they're defined, are in some senses coping with these two counterindications in the opinion. Is an assault rifle, however it's denoted, more like M16s and the like, or is it in common use? And these two things point in different directions, which of course leads to lots of litigation over which is the determinative analysis.
Just two super quick points on top of that. In Heller, the court says that the handgun is the quintessential self-defense weapon, and that self-defense is the core of the Second Amendment right. So you have the quintessential weapon for the most important part of the right, so handguns get like kind of super protected, I guess. Assault weapons, they don't say that about. And most courts since have said, look, assault weapons, however you define them, and you raise an important point, which is the definition of assault weapon is a contested and complicated matter of legislation and politics. And often when people refer to assault weapons, they don't quite know what they're talking about. They're not necessarily automatic weapons. They're usually just semi-automatic rifles with certain kind of cosmetic features. Most courts have said, nonetheless, that's not as close to the core, and so if the government can show some pretty good evidence about why they need to ban them, then that's going to be good enough for us. And one piece of evidence is that for whatever reason, even if it is just the cosmetic features, they tend to be a weapon of choice for mass shooters. And that was true at Parkland, at Sandy Hook, at Aurora, at Orlando, at Las Vegas. And so for whatever reason, even if people are just choosing them because they look scary, certain kinds of shooters tend to choose them. It's a great question.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Cook, Miller, Blocher. Basically, we've done the easy part. We've given you the knowledge and the information to do something with it. And now what happens next is really up to you. We do have a North Carolina Against Gun Violence sign-up sheet, and I believe a representative in the back near the food, if you're interested in reaching out as a possible avenue. But thank you again for all coming here. Thank you for the conversation, and please enjoy the food and the reception following.
Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carlee.